Hey everyone, so something that's been on my mind a lot recently has been Enkanomiya. For the longest time, I was under the impression that we would have to wait until the release of Enkanomiya to learn about the true history of the people of Watatsumi Island. Well, boy was I in for a surprise, because with the release of patch 2.3, MiHoYo snuck in a little lore entry into the game called the Serpent Drake of Tokoyo no Kuni that changes everything when it comes to Enkanomiya. This lore book, which you can pick up at Yae Publishing House, tells us about the history of the people of Watatsumi Island prior to Orobashi's arrival, which is interesting considering all the lore we have on Enkanomiya was written after Orobashi's death. And let me tell you, there's a ton of super interesting stuff in this lore book. Some of the things that are mentioned within this lore entry are the Dragonair, a mysterious god, and the Sun Children, just to name a few. Now, before we dive into the new lore book, I would just like to highlight that I did make a video on Enkanomiya a few weeks ago. While you don't necessarily need to watch that video, it definitely will provide some context to this new video on Enkanomiya, so if you don't know anything about Enkanomiya, I highly suggest you watch that first and then check out this video. Also, just as another disclaimer, this video is going to be pretty theory heavy, so just keep that in mind throughout the video, but without further ado, let's just jump into it. According to the new lore book, the Serpent Drake of Tokoyo no Kuni, long ago deep within the ocean depths, there existed a small civilization of humans. Living within the ocean depths, these people struggled to survive as they were constantly attacked and eaten by a dangerous creature known as the Dragonair. Unfortunately, their suffering would continue until one day the lone sage Abe Yoshihisa came upon the great god of Tokoyo. According to the legends, this great god would give Yoshihisa the gift of wisdom. Using his newfound wisdom and knowledge, the sage Yoshihisa would create an underground star to bring light to the people of Enkanomiya. As its light pierced the darkness of the ocean's abyss, the star's light would drive away the Dragonair and protect its people from the monster's attacks. Additionally, the creation of the star would also give birth to a new generation of beings known as the Sun Children. With this newfound peace, the people would elect the first Sun Child as their leader. For a time, the sage and the Sun Children would coexist peacefully. However, as time passed, the first Sun Child would grow corrupt, using his newfound power to oppress the righteous and force the people into worshipping him. Growing jealous of Abe Yoshihisa's wisdom and power, the Sun Child would seize the lone sage and imprison him. Though they no longer face the threat of the Dragonair, the people of Enkanomiya face a different threat from within, their tyrant of a leader. Many years would pass until one day a group of children dared a young boy to dive into the depths of the ocean to find a rare dragon bone flower. Skillfully diving into the abyss, the boy would evade the Dragonair and find his way into a strange underwater cave. It was in this cave that the boy would find a giant serpent. As he looked upon the mighty serpent, the boy would muster the strength to speak to the giant being. The lonely serpent looked upon the boy in favor and offered to grant the boy's deepest desire. The boy responded by asking the serpent to become their god. After granting his wish, the boy and the serpent would develop a kinship and would make their way back to the kingdom to fight against the Sun Child, the Dragonair, and any other threats that face the people of Enkanomiya. So with this brief summary out of the way, I'm sure y'all can tell that there's a lot we have to unpack here. But before we really get into it, we need to go over the background of the lore book. Now, something we need to talk about here is the name of the lore book, the Serpent Drake of Tokoyo no Kuni. The most important thing to note here is that the phrase Tokoyo no Kuni can be roughly translated as the land of the eternal night. This really confused me because this is yet another name for this underwater civilization. With this addition to the game, it means that we have three names for this underwater city: Tokoyo no Kuni, Byakuya no Kuni, and Enkanomiya. Obviously, this is really confusing, but I think this is done on purpose. My theory here is that each name is used to indicate a different period of history for this underwater city. First, we start off with Tokoyo no Kuni, which is used to describe the period of time the people of Enkanomiya lived in the darkness, what they call their eternal night. However, the darkness does not last long, as the creation of the underground star brings light to the land. Because of this, the land is then known as the Byakuya no Kuni, which can be translated as the land of the midnight sun. An interesting thing to note here is that in Japanese, Byakuya no Kuni is used to describe a situation where the sun remains visible at night. This perfectly describes the setting of the underwater city, as the purpose of the underground star was to push back the darkness and keep the Dragonair at bay. Lastly, when the people left the city to live on the surface, it became known as Enkanomiya, or the Palace of the Abyssal Depths. So as you can clearly see, there's a clear progression and meaning to the names given to Enkanomiya. And going forward in this video, I'll be using Enkanomiya to refer to the city to avoid any confusion. Anyways, with this introduction to Enkanomiya out of the way, we can get onto the exciting stuff, the analysis of the contents of the lore book, and specifically the characters, because they give us the most insight into the history of Enkanomiya. I want to start off with the god of Tokoyo and Abe Yoshihisa because it is directly through their actions that they are able to save the people of Enkanomiya from the Dragonair. Probably the most mysterious character of this entire lore entry is the god of Tokoyo, which can be translated as the god of eternal night. According to the lore book, the god of Tokoyo gave the lone sage, Abe Yoshihisa, the wisdom to create an underground star for the people of Enkanomiya. Given this knowledge, I think we can make a few guesses as to the identity of this god. My first theory is that the god of Tokoyo was one of the three moon sisters. In Genshin's lore so far, we don't know of any other gods that oversee the night besides the moon sisters. In the Tsurumi Island murals, we can see a civilization that once worshipped the moon. The mural also seems to depict that civilization flourishing under the guidance of the moon, so that could be a reference to the moon sisters. There's also various lore entries that talk about how the moon sisters guided the Seelies. Though we don't have many stories on the connection between the moon sisters and humans, it sounds like they were gentle gods, so it's possible that the moon sisters also helped guide early human civilizations. Given this information, it could very well be possible that one of the moon sisters came across the people of Enkanomiya and felt pity for them, so they taught the lone sage how to defend the people from the Dragonair by creating an underground star. However, this is probably the weakest theory here just because there's not a whole lot of evidence that supports this idea. My second theory is that the god of Tokoyo is Nabirius. Now, if you haven't heard of Nabirius before, that's probably because this god is only mentioned in Albedo's lore and backstory. According to Albedo, while adventuring in some domains with his master Rhyndaughtr, they came across an artifact called the Heart of Nabirius. It was upon the discovery of this artifact that Rhyndaughtr would abandon Albedo and send him off to Mondstadt. Without diving too deep into this, there's speculation that this artifact is related to a god or archon, since the name Nabirius can be traced back to the Ars Goetia, a demonology text that's inspired the names of gods within Teyvat. But why do I think that Nabirius is the god of Tokoyo? Well, according to the lore book, the god of Tokoyo gifted the lone sage with wisdom. And interestingly, in my research, I found that one of Nabirius's powers is that he can gift people with knowledge and wisdom. If this is true, Nabirius could be responsible for gifting the lone sage with the knowledge and power to create an underground star. Additionally, Albedo and Rhyndaughtr found this artifact while exploring domains underground. And you know what else is underground? Enkanomiya. Because of this, it's very possible that the god of Tokoyo is Nabirius. However, I do need to note that there are some counter theories here. The main one being that Nabirius could have been the former Dendro Archon. In the game, there's a few lore entries that seem to hint that the Dendro Archon died within Khaenri'ah. This would explain why Albedo and Rhyndaughtr found the heart of Nabirius within a domain. Also, if Nabirius was truly the former Dendro Archon, it seems a bit strange that she somehow ended up in Enkanomiya hundreds of years ago. Either way, this is an interesting theory to consider here. My final theory, and the one that I find the most plausible, is that the god of Tokoyo is Abe Yoshihisa. Something that I found suspicious in this lore entry is that it seems to imply that no one actually knows how Abe Yoshihisa obtained his wisdom, but according to legends it was through the god of Tokoyo. Just from this, it seems to hint that the source of his wisdom could be something else entirely. Additionally, the fact that the god of Tokoyo is only mentioned once in this lore book seems a bit odd. It's just a little strange that a god would just show up one day and bless one person with wisdom and then disappear. If anything, it would make more sense if the god stayed around to guide and protect the people. That being said, the lone sage's powers and abilities make me wonder if he's more than just a wise human. First of all, he was able to create a star underground, which doesn't seem to be something that would be easy to do. Additionally, the lore book says something interesting about the origins of the Sun Children, which reads as follows. Yet, these children of the sun never considered that had Yoshihisa not created that underground star, they would have never existed. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but perhaps Yoshihisa himself created these beings. It might sound crazy, but it's not outside the realm of possibility, especially considering Reindotter and alchemists like Albedo are able to use their powers to bring objects to life. In any case, this is something to consider, but hold on to this thought as we'll get into the Sun Children later in this video. Lastly, I'd like to point out that Yoshihisa seems to have been somewhat involved in governing Enkanomiya. Maybe he wasn't the one calling the shots, but he sounds like a figure that would use his wisdom to guide the people. He also seems to have intimate knowledge of Teyvat's creation, stating that the universe has no beginning or end and that the origins of heaven and earth are like the chicken and the egg. Now, I don't know about you guys, but all of this is pretty suspect for Yoshihisa to just be a wise old man. Because of this, I suspect that he is the god of Tokoyo and took on the name Abe Yoshihisa to hide his true identity. But let me know who you think Abe Yoshihisa and the god of Tokoyo are down in the comments below. Before we move on to the Sun Children, we should briefly talk about the Dragonair. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, especially since I covered it in my prior Enkanomiya video. But generally speaking, there's not that much that we know about this creature. However, based on the lore book, we learn that the Dragonair specifically hunted the people of Enkanomiya. It got so bad that, according to the lore book, he grazed on the people as if he were grazing on grass. Another thing we learn about the Dragonair is that it doesn't like the light. Because of this specific weakness, the lone sage Abe Yoshihisa was able to use the underground star as a light source to drive away the Dragonair. So it seems that although Abe Yoshihisa was able to repel the Dragonair, he was still unable to defeat it. It wouldn't be until the rise of Orobashi that the people would be finally free of the threat of the Dragonair. Obviously, this still isn't a lot of information, but at the current moment, we know that the Dragonair is still alive and that it's been sealed away by Orobashi. However, according to the Shrine Maiden Miyuki, the seal holding back the Dragonair is weakening. So this could possibly hint at a future confrontation between the Dragonair and the Traveler. With the Dragonair out of the way, we need to talk about the Sun Children because this part of the lore is extremely fascinating. As I stated earlier, the creation of the underground star also brought the Sun Children into existence. But what exactly are the Sun Children? I personally am not too sure about this, but my own interpretation of this is that the Sun Children refer to the ruling class born after the creation of the underground star. However, based on the lore book, it is possible that the Sun Children are a species separate from humans. But what evidence do we have to support this theory? Well, in the Moon-Bathed Deep questline, the Shrine Maiden Miyuki is concerned that the spirit of Enkanomiya will turn all of the dirt on Watatsumi Island into holy or purified soil. According to Miyuki, this bleached soil is white in coloration and can't be used to grow vegetables. Now, maybe it's just me, but doesn't this sound like another substance we know of in Teyvat? Perhaps chalk? This is going to go down into conspiracy theory territory, but I believe that the bleached soil that Miyuki is referring to is chalk. And from various quotes from both Venti and Albedo, we know that chalk is the purest form of soil, which is responsible for creating life. So if Enkanomiya has large amounts of chalk, perhaps Abe Yoshihisa used some form of magic or alchemy to create the Sun Children using some of that chalk. Another thing that seems to be a bit odd is that there is a distinction between the regular people and the Sun Children. Though it's never fully fleshed out in the lore book, it's hinted that there is something different between these two groups. But for me personally, I still think that the Sun Children are human and that the term is used to refer to the generations of humans born after the creation of the underground star. Though the creation of the underground star or sun would bring peace to the nation of Enkanomiya, it would also present new threats for the people to face, one of them being their own elected ruler, the Sun Child. According to the lore book, the people would choose the first Sun Child as their king and even worshipped him. Unfortunately, the Sun Child would become a corrupt and brutal ruler. He would grow jealous of Yoshihisa and would even imprison the lone sage, possibly executing him as well, but that's not confirmed. It's not exactly exactly stated why the Sun Child became such a ruthless ruler, but I suspect that having power corrupted the first Sun Child. The story of the first Sun Child seems to be very similar to that of Joffrey from Game of Thrones. In Game of Thrones, Joffrey ascends to the throne after his father's death and uses his power for his own selfish gain. I believe something similar happened here with the first Sun Child. With the people choosing him as king and worshipping him as a god, I believe the first Sun Child felt entitled to his power, and instead of helping the people, he focused on using his power for his own benefit. Another similarity between Joffrey and the Sun Child is that they would use their power to brutally take out any opposing forces. For the Sun Child, it meant imprisoning the lone sage Abe Yoshihisa, and for Joffrey, it meant killing Ned Stark. With such a brutal and self-absorbed ruler, I'm sure the people of Enkanomiya would grow sick of his reign. Hundreds of years would pass until the fateful meeting between a young boy and what the lore book calls the Profane Serpent. At this point, I'm sure y'all have gathered that the Profane Serpent here is Orobashi. According to the bit of Erosidite and the Jade Coral Branch lore entries, Orobashi was one of the gods who fled to the Dark Sea after losing in the Archon War. After fleeing, Orobashi would make his way into a cave deep beneath the sea, hiding away from the rest of the world. We don't know how long he hid in this cave, but eventually a young boy would discover him there. Though I recapped this earlier, I found the actual encounter between the two to be so well written, so here's an excerpt from the lore book. Somehow, as he gazed upon the serpent's titanic form, the child felt no fear, but instead a kind of kinship. I am the Profane Serpent. Though my servants are numberless, not one mortal dwells in my shadow. That I have fallen into this realm and that we would meet. Perhaps this is fate. You are not one of my people, but you are human nonetheless. Speak your desire, and I shall hear it. Could you then perchance become our god? Thus did they, human and serpent, go forth to face the royal authority of the Sun Child and the incursions of the Dragonair beyond. Thus was the curtain raised on the turning of the tide. So if you haven't guessed it by now, I believe that this child was one of Kokomi's ancestors, the first Sangonomiya. The interaction here is so interesting because Orobashi openly admits that he was a god fallen from grace. It also appears that he was a very caring god as well, as he treats the child kindly and listens to him. I also found it really interesting that the boy would ask Orobashi to be their god. This request also confirms the idea that living under the Sun Child was not ideal and that the people wanted to be free of his cruel reign. Lastly, I also wanted to point out that this story is extremely similar to that of Venti and his rebellion against Decarabian. In both stories, a child befriends a god or a spirit in Venti's case, and together they lead a rebellion against their corrupt rulers. The only difference is that in Orobashi's case, his fate would not be pleasant as he was executed by the Raiden Shogun. So, with that lengthy analysis of the lore done, I'm sure everyone is wondering, what will Enkanomiya be like when it's released in the game? Well, the lorebook doesn't say that much about the land itself, but there is one really suspicious section of the lore that tells us a bit more about this mysterious land, and it reads as follows. Mysterious creation conceals, sun and moon omens reveal, three corners in darkness shrouded, the void by five saints clouded. The universe has no beginning and no end. And so it was with the land that once was, but this matters not to us. For the land that bears us has anything to do with that eternity without start or ceasing, so said the lone sage Abe Yoshihisa to the first Sun Child. So a lot of riddles and strange language here, but this is my theory as to what we can expect from Enkanomiya. So the first line where it talks about mysterious creation, I have no idea about. However, the section about the sun and moon omens revealing something is really interesting. My theory here is that maybe there are symbols or letters that can only be revealed with the power of the moon or the power of the sun. So there could be some switches or buttons we have to engage with that change the atmosphere so it reflects the sun's light or the moon's light. Once this is done, it will reveal certain things in the world that couldn't be seen in the other mode. I don't know if that made sense, but basically we can only see a certain set of things during the sun mode and another set of things in the moon mode. Next, it mentions that there are three corners shrouded in darkness. My belief here is that in Enkanomiya, there will be three areas that the light of the underground star cannot reach. It's in these regions that we might have to fight the Dragonair as he cannot stand the light. As for the void by 5 saints clouded, I'm not entirely sure, but perhaps there are 5 areas that are shrouded by the saints of Enkanomiya, or maybe there are 5 temples that have some sort of mechanism causing them to be hidden. Either way, it sounds like Enkanomiya is going to feature a lot of new mechanics and puzzles that we'll have to solve. As for the quote from the lone sage, he makes it sound like Enkanomiya exists on a different timeline than the rest of Teyvat. The sage says that Enkanomiya has nothing to do with the eternity that exists elsewhere in Teyvat. If this is true, this could possibly mean that time itself is non-existent or works differently for this underwater city. Because of this, there may be some kind of new time mechanic that we'll have to deal with while in this area, but that's just a theory. Let me know what y'all think this could mean for Enkanomiya down in the comments below. Okay, so that's it for today's video on Enkanomiya. Honestly, there's too much to talk about here when it comes to the lore. I actually found myself jumping into so many rabbit holes and different interpretations that I ended up having to cut out a bunch of stuff. Also, I tried a different format of video here, so let me know if you guys liked it. If you did, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe. I also have my socials linked down below, so feel free to check me out there, and I'll see you all next time. Peace!